The national education policy, according to me, is an intellectually sterile document. Is full of homilies and statements which have roots in fantasy rather than reality. It is almost completely devoid of any useful statistics which will give the reader at least a dim idea that what is being recommended is based on reason and proper analysis. Even in the 1986 policy document, there was a summary at the beginning of every chapter with a few statistics. This report almost has no statistics. Let me make my point clear. A policy need not be changed just because it has been framed about 30 years ago. If it has to be changed, cogent reasons ought to be given. It's not my case that the existing policy is wonderful. Far from it. But I'm afraid what is replacing it seems to be worse than the one we have now. It is constructed, unfortunately, it is constructed almost entirely on a foundation of pious wishes. What is galling is that there's a glaring discrepancy between the draft policy pronounced by the Kasturirangan committee and the final policy pronouncement of the government, even in presenting the scarce statistics available. For instance, the draft policy says public expenditure on education in India was 2.7% of the GDP in 2017 and 2018. On the other hand, the government's policy pronouncement says that the current expenditure on education has been around 4.43% of the GDP. This is slipshod in the extreme, and it betrays the shockingly unprofessional fashion Kasturirangan committee has approached the problem. I am using very harsh words, but I have no other option. The committee had a joint secretary from the government, and he should have checked the statistics given in the draft policy. Now, based on this figure, the Kasturirangan committee recommends at least doubling of the expenditure on education, which will be around 6% of the GDP. Strangely, the government too wants to keep the expenditure on education at around 6%, which means that it is prepared to spend an extra 1.5% of the GDP. The Kasturirangan committee recommended 3% extra on GDP. Now, the government wants to spend only 1.5% of the GDP. This means the government is prepared to spend only half of what the committee has proposed. So, what are the areas in which this expenditure will be curtailed? There is absolutely no clue in the policy pronouncement. In fact, it was to read and unravel what has been said by the Kasturirangan committee. There is no summary of its recommendations anywhere. It had recommended creation of many new bureaucratic structures, but there is no list of them anywhere. The policy too is a mishmash of various pronouncements with no summary of them anywhere in the policy document. It does not say anywhere what are the accepted recommendations of the Kasturirangan committee and what are the recommendations not accepted. The confusion is so much that when the cabinet approved the policy, the newspapers reported that there would be a Rashtriya Shiksha Ayog, a national education commission, which would be headed by the Prime Minister. This was recommended by the Kasturirangan committee. Strangely, the policy pronouncement contains nothing about this commission, about this Ayog. Now, let us deal with the financial aspects before coming to the actual pronouncements. The Kasturirangan committee has envisioned an increase of public spending on education. I said 3% of the extra 3% of the GDP. How will these additional funds be allocated? See, now the government is spending about 10% of its budget on education. The Kasturirangan committee wants this to be increased to 20.9%, of which it wants 5.4% to be allocated to higher education and 5.5% to school education, right from the early childhood education, that is classes below first standard. According to the latest MHRD figures, the number of students going to schools in I think 2016 and 17 work out around 26 crores. This doesn't include the children at the ECE zone, that is the early childhood education zone, for which the committee recommends 1.4% of the total expenditure. So, for school education, the recommendation will be 4.1% of the allocation. Please listen to these figures very, very carefully. This is very important. 5.4% for higher education, 5.5% for the school education and ECE. For school education alone, it is 4.1%. This is the recommendation of the Kasturirangan committee, about which the policy doesn't say anything. So I presume that the policy has accepted this recommendation. Okay. Now, what are the number of persons who are studying in colleges? In India, it is around 3.5 crores. Of them, 60% will be in humanities stream, who do not cost much money. The lion's share of proposed allocation for higher education will therefore go to science and technology. This amounts to about 20 times more than the per capita expenditure on school education. Okay, by my calculation, a rough calculation, the Kasturirangan committee proposes to spend on higher education per capita basis 20 times more than what will be spent on school education on per capita basis. No state government will be able to spend such a huge sum on higher education. Even the central government will not be able to spend such a sum on higher education. For instance, in the 2020 union budget, the share was 60:40 in favor of schools. In the Tamil Nadu budget of 2020, the school education carried a budget of 30,000 crores. The higher education carried a budget of 5,000 crores. So, the entire exercise seems to be on a fantasy. No government is going to spend that much of money on higher education. It is not possible. It is not practical. That's what I think. The committee should have given how they have arrived at these figures, but nothing is there in Kasturirangan committee and nothing is there in the government's policy. The policy perhaps hopes that philanthropists, corporates and alumni will chip in and contribute hugely towards higher education. If past is any indication, Our corporate sector is niggardly or miserly when it comes to funding non-profit education. Philanthropy, barring a few honorable exceptions, is passé nowadays. That's not very fashionable. And in any case, either philanthropy or alumni support is not likely to be statistically significant. The glaring reality in India is that at every level, education is a profit making business, and most of the players in the field are extortionists. The policy doesn't take into consideration this fact, and hence its recommendations are fit for a fantasy land and not for the grimy, poor, and unevenly educated India. Anyway, now we'll come to the points made by the committee one by one and analyze it. The noisy criticisms made by the Tamil Nadu political parties on the three-language formula are insincere and crassly chauvinistic. The formula is being carried around like a milestone by successive policy and pronouncements on education from 1966 onwards. There is a huge grinding stone, they are carrying from 1966 onwards, and this policy is no exception. So far, the central government has not been able to persuade many Hindi-speaking states to find a cure for the single language syndrome they seem to suffer from. This being the case, there's no way the three-language formula could be thrust on unwilling state governments. Language issues are like powder kegs, and the center knows much better than to ignite them. The continuing din in Tamil Nadu and some other places, however, has resulted in a wholly unexpected outcome. It has ensured that several other pronouncements on school education, which are very important and new, remain more or less undiscussed. In our blessed state, Tamil Nadu, intellectual laziness is the basic qualification to be certified a Tamil intellectual. Let me repeat it again. In our blessed state, Tamil Nadu, intellectual laziness is the basic qualification to be certified a Tamil intellectual. No wonder these half a penny wonders confine themselves to language issues and waste time abusing Sanskrit. There are many other issues to be discussed, but no one is discussing it. The policy envisages that children will join the stream of education from the age 3 onwards. Anganwadis, it says, will be strengthened and expanded to include a robust education component. Wherever possible, they will be co-located with the primary schools. In any case, they will all be pedagogically linked to primary schools in their areas. Education is likely to be compulsory from the age of 3. The school curriculum and the pedagogy will be restructured in a new 5-3-3-4 design. Let me explain this design to you. This practically means that school starts at the age of 3. There will be a foundational level which includes Anganwadi level and first 2 standards. Then there's a preparatory level, that is 3rd to 5th standard. There's a middle level, that is 6th to 8th standard. And the secondary level from 9th to 12th standard. Let us discuss this foundational education in some detail. The report, others, in fact, we have time for that, let us discuss this. NCERT is supposed to make a national curricular and pedagogical framework for this. This I consider will be disastrous. NCERT has, I don't think NCERT has any experience in this field. Even otherwise, the NCERT, this means that NCERT will be a big brother even to kids who are just out of the suckling stage. We all know that other than issuing vague and general inanities, NCERT is poorly equipped to do anything of value in the area of child education. Come to think of it, India is a country of 6.4 lakh villages. The dialectical and cultural variations among them are mind-boggling. A child of a tender age of 3 will surely be better served by local experts than by a distant Delhi genius. Now let us come to the specifics. As regards ECE, the so-called early childhood education, we all know that the situation varies from state to state. For instance, in Gujarat, 90% of children of this age are in some form of preschool. But the biggest state of Uttar Pradesh, 65% of such children are not going anywhere. They stay home. The money spent on school is also not producing the required outcome. For instance, the percentage of children, this statistics for 2008, the percent 2018 and 2008, the percentage of children at standard 5 who can read at standard 2 level was 53.1 in 2008. In 2018, it is 44.2%. That is, it's come down by almost 9%. This is the state of affairs in our schools. We spend money, but the results are not very satisfactory. Again, we all know that the per capita income on education varies from state to state. Unsurprisingly, Bihar spends the least, and rich states, of course, spends the most. There is an annual status of education report which comes every year, which says a very important, which makes a very important point. It says the enormous expansion in the number of children entering the education system has meant that there is much more diversity among the children, as was the case a generation ago. It's a very important point. There's much more diversity among the children, as was the case a generation ago. Neither the pre-primary or primary classrooms are designed to address the increase in diversity in the needs and characteristics of the children they cater to. Thus, it is impossible for the NCERT to come out with a national framework which will cater to the amazingly varying needs of our children. The states, we agree, even though many of them are lethargic and have allowed education in the domains to decay, are still the prime players in the game. We will have to acknowledge it. Education, we must remember, is still on the concurrent list, and rightly so. Let us do some fact checks. This is very, very important. In the latest data available from 2015, where Anganwadis could cover only 8.4 out of 16.4 children under the age of 6. Almost 50% of the children who ought to be covered under the scheme are outside it. Even Niti Aayog considers Anganwadi primarily as providers of nutritional and health support to both children and lactating mothers. And we all know that Anganwadi workers are all poorly paid. This we know, all of us know this. The present budget allocation for Anganwadis is around 20,000 crores. And this figure doesn't take into account the money spent by the state governments, which vary widely from state to state. This has to be multiplied, this has to be increased multiple times, and all states have to be brought on the same page for the policy pronouncement to be implemented with even a modest degree of success. Be that as it may, is it really a good idea to send a malnourished and a terrified Indian child of three to Anganwadis for receiving education which is supposed to be playful and relaxing? Do we have sufficient number of qualified educators for the task, when even the existing educators who are supposedly qualified fall far short of what is expected of them? A significant number of children of the age of 3, this is an unfortunate fact in India and I would like to highlight it. A significant number of children of the age of 3 are not likely to have developed speech and language enough that people outside the family understand what they are saying. Anganwadis turned into preschools might prove too traumatic for them. This integration, I think, is a bombshell. There's no need to tinker with the present 5 plus 3 plus 4 system when we do not have sufficient qualified person to administer the present system. Even if we have the wherewithal, clubbing preschool with primary classes doesn't seem to be a great idea. While the primary school in India has a definite shape and a known set of rules, a typical preschool is unorganized, without any recognizable shape, and run by untrained persons. Coupling them together will result only in further chaos. There is absolutely no doubt that preschool system needs a set of regulations, but they should be distinct from primary schools. In any case, in most of the developed countries, preschool education is optional and compulsory education starts only from the age of 6. To make school education compulsory for a child of 3, which seems to be the idea, to make it compulsory will be draconian and resisted by most of the parents, and it's not likely to be implemented in India. See, the policy makes many funny statements, and let me tackle with some of the statements. The policy says this: every literate member of the community could commit to teaching one student how to read, and it would change the country's landscape very quickly. I entirely agree with this, but is it practical? The recommendation towards achieving sufficient foundational literacy and numeracy are really heartwarming, but they are likely to be pious wishes for quite some time. The student-teacher ratio is not likely to improve soon. Neither are we going to have enough volunteers to take on the task of educating the children. So this every literate member of the community, which is another way of saying each one teach one, is a old and a sharp-worn slogan. The bitter fact is, the Indian middle class, which has to take a lead in this respect, is in general very self-centered, and it cares a fig about universal literacy or numeracy. In fact, literate servants are a nuisance, unlike illiterates who not only know their places but also know what their deserved salaries are. They will not revolt. On the other hand, a literate servant might revolt. Yes, the middle class should be motivated if such a thing is possible. However, the report has a very nice suggestion. It says that the dropout should be tracked with the technical tools available with us now, and we should find out why they are dropping out of the schools. Here, in fact, volunteers and social service agencies can do a great job if they are motivated. Now, let me come to some of the other statements of the policy. We all know that certain disciplines are universal in character. Science, mathematics, any technological subject, and medicines all have contents that cannot vary from country to country. Okay, that is whatever is there in that content cannot vary. That cannot vary from country to country. Even if Ayurveda is taught in, let's say, Harvard Medical School, his content cannot vary from what is being taught in India. On the other hand, language, literature, culture, even sports could have contents that may vary from country to country, even state to state. Thus, when the policy states all curriculum and pedagogy from the foundational stage onwards will be redesigned to be strongly rooted in the Indian and local context and ethos in terms of culture, traditions, heritage, customs, language, philosophy, geography, ancient and contemporary knowledge, societal and scientific needs, indigenous and traditional ways of learning, etc. This is a statement made by this. It is talking absolute nonsense. 4 plus 4 is 8 anywhere in the world. On the other hand, Shakespeare may not be considered a great dramatist anywhere in the world. The entire policy document is full of such vague and irritating statements which have nothing to do with education, but everything to do with the ideology of the present government. In this backdrop, the idea of national textbooks suggested by the policy should be viewed with extreme caution. It is good to have common textbooks for science, mathematics, economics, political theory, etc. But when it comes to history and languages, it is better to have local state governments to decide what sort of history would be taught to its children. Should we have national textbooks? I don't think so. Especially on subjects like history, I don't think so. Rajaraja is considered a great king in Tamil Nadu, but he was resisted even in the Pandya country in the southern Tamil Nadu. In Karnataka, he was a villain. In fact, what about Pulikesi? He was a great Chalukya king, but he will never be considered great in Tamil Nadu. What about Tippu? I can add. I can quote many such historical figures. Okay, there are local heroes everywhere in India. A common textbook will never be able to highlight them. Though the policy says that all textbooks shall aim to contain the essential core material deemed important on a national level, but at the same time contain any desired nuances and supplementary material as per local context and needs. In my view, there is no need to have an essential core material at the national level except a broad brush treatment of what should be taught in the schools. Okay, there is no need for the central government or for the NCERT to dictate what type of history should be taught in states like Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra or many other states which have a rich history, which have a rich local history. They know what is to be taught to the children. See, the policy envisions examinations in grade 3, 5, 8, which will be at school level for assessment purposes. There will of course be board examinations at 10th and 12th grade too. But good marks in 12 may not be enough for going to college. The policy says there will be a national testing agency which will offer a high quality common aptitude test as well as specialized common subject exams in the sciences, humanities, languages, arts and vocational subjects at least twice every year. Let me repeat. there will be a national testing agency which will test the students who are coming out of 12 on in sciences, humanities, languages, arts, vocational subjects, and everything, every other subject. The policy says these exams shall test conceptual understanding and the ability to apply knowledge and shall aim to eliminate the need for coaching for these exams. Students will be able to choose the subjects for taking the test, and each university will be able to see each student's individual subjects portfolio and admit students into their programs based on individual interests and talents. Of course, it's a very, very lofty idea, but I do not know whether this is clearly thought through. A common examination for even entry into colleges of languages, arts, and commerce appears to be superfluous when most seats in many colleges in these subjects go a-begging. We all know that. The board results should be enough. There's no point in wasting the time of students for examination in humanities and arts when there are many seats in these colleges are not going to be there are not going to be any competition for the seats in any of the colleges. Individual as regards the coaching colleges, unless there's a legal ban on coaching colleges, there's no way such colleges could be stopped in India. And individual interests and talents, we all know. No, again, let me repeat this sad fact. Individual interests and talents have no say in a student choosing a subject in the college. He chooses a subject because he thinks he will get a job after he passes out of the college. Unless the government is able to assure jobs for the students in the area in which they have talent, such pronouncements will have absolutely no meaning. Again, India has public 28% of India's public primary schools, and about 15% of its upper primary schools have less than 30 students. Even 28% and 15% have less than 30 students. The average number of students per grade in the elementary schooling system, that is up to grade 8, is about 14, with a notable proportion having less than 6 per grade, only 6 students per grade. Okay, during the statistics we have in 2016 and 17, there are about 1 lakh single teacher schools. Majority of them serving in primary schools of grades 1 and 5. These teachers will have to be jacks of all trades to render meaningful education to children. To tide over this problem, the policy suggests school clusters and complexes. This is not a new recommendation. This recommendation, if I am not mistaken, is there even in the Kothari committee recommendation. But it has never been implemented. Now is the time to implement it. See, to tide over the problem, the policy suggests school clusters and complexes. This is what the policy says. One possible mechanism for accomplishing the above should be the establishment of a grouping structure called a school complex, consisting of one secondary school together with all other schools offering lower grades in its neighborhood, including Anganwadis, in a radius of 5 to 10 kilometers. This is a very good idea, not a new idea, it's an old idea, but it's a very good idea if implemented sensibly. So long as the children are not made to travel long distances, the school complexes are likely to address the problem of imparting at least a sort of a quality education to children who are now deprived of it. The other important thing which the policy hasn't in fact addressed is the poor state of our public schools. It mentions in passing, but it actually hasn't addressed it, very deeply or sensibly. In these schools, in our public schools, government schools, in fact, the teachers get their salaries. That's about all. The infrastructure is poor and teaching is worse. This is the reason why private extortionist English schools are mushrooming. We all know that. The policy has absolutely no clue as to how to tackle this problem. Okay, they say that a agency at state level will be set, which will be called State School Standards Authority. This authority is unlikely to solve the problem. Why does this problem persist? We know that, that the teacher should have a basic tested competence is known to every one of us. But our political system considers education a milk cow. Hence, any competitive process that aims to select teachers impartially is likely to be, why is likely? It is certain to be subverted by the political class and the ones who will be benefited by this class. And they will ensure that the process will be opaque. The policy, of course, envisages a teacher eligibility test for both public and private schools, which is welcome. In fact, there should be a teacher eligibility test. But in there is a huge problem, which has to be addressed if this happens. We have about 17,000 teachers training establishments, and 92% of these establishments are in private hands, and a large proportion of them are commercial shops where B.Ed degrees are available for a price. In the event of government holding eligibility tests, not many of the teachers graduated from the shops are likely to clear them, and the usual howl of relaxing the standard will be heard. On the other hand, the problem is we are greatly short of teachers, both competent and not so competent. The shortage today is, someone says, is about 15 lakhs, about 1.5 million. Most rural schools suffer in the bargain. Now, if the teaching shops are shut down, in fact, the Kasturi Committee recommends that they should be shut down. Where will the teachers come from? The policy offers the solution of a merger of teacher education to the university stream, which is supposed to start a 4-year integrated Bachelor of Education program. This is a very important recommendation which should be implemented by all state governments. There will be an interim period which will be problematic, but in the long run, our children will be benefited. Now, what is shocking about this policy statement is that it wastes too many pages on culture, language, and the past glory of India. That Nalanda was once a top-notch university, or that Banabhatta in his Kadambari says, Kadambari speaks of 64 arts, is of little comfort to a young boy in search of a quality college in modern Bihar or Uttar Pradesh. Any professional report would have clearly discussed the problems facing our ITIs, our polytechnics, our engineering colleges, our medical colleges, our scientific institutions, our research institutions, and offered specific solutions to them. In this report, in this policy, most of the pronouncements are generic and they can be interpreted in any way you like. Especially in this report, ITIs, polytechnics, engineering colleges, and medical colleges have all been dealt with rather cursory. Let me give an example. There are 13,000 ITIs in this country, almost 85% of them in private sector. The number of students studying in them run into millions. It is shocking that these institutes, which to impart very important skills, are deemed not fit to be considered educational institutions. The same is the fate of polytechnics. The report in fact wants ITIs and polytechnics to be integrated into the mainstream. It says vocational education will be integrated into all school and higher education institutions in a phased manner over the next decade. Focus areas for vocational education will be chosen based on skills gap analysis and mapping of local opportunities. MHRD will constitute a national committee for the integration of vocational education consisting of experts in vocational education and representatives across ministries in collaboration with industry to oversee this effort. In Tamil Nadu, this will be seen as a revisit of the Rajaji's infamous educational formula. I don't know, because nobody wants to have vocational education in schools. Okay, that is this is a major political statement, and I don't know how it will be received in many states, especially in a sensitive state like Tamil Nadu. But do the policy recommend that there will not be any ITI or polytechnic anymore in future? We are not sure. The policy is vague about this. See, this is the entire approach of the policy seems to be that every problem faced in the field of education can be solved by creation of several new institutions, especially at the center. There's a huge bureaucratic institutions at the center. We all know that all these institutions are likely to cost money, big money. In fact, they want to have an umbrella body. They want to have a huge umbrella body called Higher Education Commission of India, a grand sounding name, Higher Education Commission of India. It will have 4 independent verticals. There are several other new organizations which are being proposed. Let me talk about these organizations. These verticals will be regulation, and the other is accreditation, and then third will be for funding. The fourth will be for academic standard setting. Okay. And they want similar organizations at the state level also. Well, this is what they do. This is what they recommend, the policy says. And then we will also have a national, believe it or not, we should also have a national research foundation which will be created and given the pride of place. The idea seems to be to create another empire which is supposed to receive a huge annual grant. Individuals that currently fund research at some level, such as DST or DAE or DBE or ICAR, ICMR, UGC, as well as several private and philanthropic organizations will continue to independently fund research according to their priorities and needs. This is what the report says. So when this being the case, what is the need of creating another new institutions for this purpose? Only God alone knows. If CSIR is an example, CSIR has the Prime Minister as the chairman, as the president, and the vice president is the Science and Technology Minister. It is supposed to foster scientific and industrial research in this country. It has been in existence for more than 75 years. It has several laboratories all over the country. Excepting a few, they are all a huge drain on the exchequer with absolutely no accountability. Have they fostered scientific and industrial research? An honest answer will be no, excepting a few. If the foundation will fare far worse, but this is an enormous foundation, and it will never be, we will be, never be able to find out whether its funding has yielded any result or not. At least CSIR is not that amorphous. This foundation appears to be a very amorphous organization. Okay. On the other hand, CSIR, when it came about, had no rivals. The proposed foundation, on the other hand, will have clear rivals in every funding ministry. They will not countenance another organization trying to carve out a territory for itself from their domains. Also, it is nobody's case that the central should not give suggestions to state government in the area of higher education, creating a gargantuan overseeing organization at the center. Okay, this will be, let me say this again. If you create a gargantuan, organization at the center, it will be viewed with suspicion by all the states. It only says that state government is not able to fund this research properly, so they need a chaperone who will develop as a master when the occasion demands. So there is absolutely no reason for creating a national research foundation when there are many funding agencies already available in the country. What should be done is that the state government should be asked to create its own research foundations to fund research which cater to local needs. That will be the idea. The center could give grants to state governments for creating such an organization, such as state level funding, state level research organizations. As regards the medical field, the report has nothing to say about medical education except this. Let me read what they say. Health education need to be re-envisioned so that the duration, structure, design of the educational programs need to match the role requirements that graduates will play. Fine. Students will be assessed at regular intervals on well-defined parameters primarily required for working in primary care and secondary care. Okay, this is fine. So far there is nothing wrong with the report. You read this. The next line is fantastic. Given that people exercise pluralistic choices in healthcare, our healthcare education system must be integrative, meaning thereby that all students of allopathic medical education must have a basic understanding of Ayurveda, Yoga, Naturopathy, Unani, Siddha and Homeopathy. Thank God they have not included, acupuncture and vice versa. There shall also be a much greater emphasis on preventive healthcare and community medicine in all forms of healthcare education. This is a stupid motherhood statement without any sense. It doesn't address any of the problems faced by healthcare education in India. How can you have a pluralistic, education in medicine when how can an institution which considers homeopathy fraudulent teach the principles of homeopathy in its classes? I don't understand this. Why such a statement should be made in a serious policy document is beyond me. The main thrust of this policy regarding higher education is supposed to end the fragmentation of higher education by transforming the higher education institutions into large multidisciplinary universities, colleges and high education institution clusters, knowledge hubs, each of which will aim to have 3,000 or more students. This is what the policy says. That is, they want to have education institutions with a minimum strength of 3,000 students. Okay. This reads very well, but practically it doesn't mean anything. Please consider this. They want huge educational structures, higher education structures everywhere in India with a minimum strength of 3,000 students. Okay. Today, what is the reality? In India, more than 40% of the colleges are running on a single program. There will be a college of commerce, or college of arts, or college of engineering, or things like this. And 20% of our colleges have less than 100 students. How will they able to raise themselves to the level of bespoke colleges or teaching universities or major urban centers? Or should they have to cease their operations? The policy doesn't speak anything about this. It only keeps on making general statements. The irony is, on the one hand, you say we want huge colleges and small colleges should be combined or they should be eliminated. In fact, the Kasturirangan committee specifically said that the recognition will be withdrawn for such colleges. The policy doesn't say that, but the policy doesn't say that it doesn't agree with the Kasturirangan committee's recommendation. It's very vague. Okay, but the irony is, the same policy wants the GER to be increased from the existing 25% to 15% within a span of a few years. The number of students going to institutes of higher education is approximately, I said, 3.5 crores. If this is to be increased to 7 crores, we will need more colleges and not less. If the existing colleges are to cease operations, okay, or to be mocked at, how are you going to find suitable colleges for the students who will be joining the streams, will join in the education stream in large numbers? There's no answer to this question in the policy. If I have to single out one word that has kept haunting both the Kasturirangan committee and the government, it is multidisciplinary. Firstly, there's nothing unconscionable about recommending liberal education in undergraduate courses. I have absolutely no problem if colleges offer general education courses in languages, arts, music, sports, history, mathematics, science, so long as they don't act corrosively and eat into major courses. In Ivy League colleges, the choices available to the students are varied and they can choose a course which really interests them. In our conditions, we know what happens. In our conditions, such courses tend to subsist even when the students are least interested in them. Okay, because we wanted to retain the teacher. So the teacher exists, the students disappear. This has happened again and again and again in Indian universities. Okay, the students are least interested in the courses, but the teachers have to be paid the salary. The report rather frenetically cites the example of Nobel laureates in serious hobbies in the arts. This is the Kasturirangan committee in a report says, But we should not forget that an overwhelming majority of students pursuing higher education are not likely to branch off into potentially Nobel Prize winning research. Our approach should be practical, which unfortunately is not so. The other important point is I like to say this again and again and again. We are a poor country. The idea of a well-rounded personality sounds very noble and very sensational, but to turn it into a reality costs money, huge money. We don't have that money, unfortunately. Let us imagine a girl from a rural background wanting to do physics at a higher level. She has to concentrate on physics, mathematics, perhaps chemistry and biology. She will have absolutely no use for literature or history or economics or politics. She would much rather use the time to be spent on these subjects to read the subjects she is interested in. It is therefore asinine to ask her to read liberal subjects at the undergrad level. In fact, If her physics is good, she is likely to be curious, and eventually she will herself learn these subjects if she is really interested. Thus, it's a criminal waste to fritter away good money on harebrained and supposedly noble ideas. The money could be better spent on strengthening what we already have. In fact, the major problem in our country in the field of education is the intrusion of thieves, black marketers, and liquor barons. They are not keeping aloof. They interfere at every stage of education. This is a story right from the preschool stage to the postgraduate stage and even further. Education is a huge business and an extortionist business. Major politicians are involved in this business, and philanthropy is far from their mind. So it's amusing to read this passage from the National Education Policy. This is what the policy says. Private higher education institutions having a philanthropic and public spirited intent will be encouraged through a progressive regime of fees determination. Transparent mechanism for fixing of fees with an upper limit for different types of institutions depending on their accreditation will be developed so that individual institutions are not adversely affected. This will empower private higher education institutions to set fees for their programs independently, though within the laid out norms and the broad applicable regulatory mechanism. All fees and charges set by private higher education institutions will be transparently and fully disclosed, and there shall be no arbitrary increases in these fees charges during the period of enrollment of any student. This fee determining mechanism will ensure reasonable recovery of costs while ensuring that higher education institutions discharge their social obligations. Really? Really? Most of these private institutions, we all know, are in the field of education not to discharge their social obligations. They are there to make fat profits at the expense of the students and the parents. It's amazing that the government does not recognize this. The same goes for schools, the same goes for even the kindergarten schools. In fact, the policy doesn't recognize that it is the governments, both the central and state governments, which have single-handedly allowed the system of education to decay by progressively withdrawing from it. It had exacerbated the problem by allowing, in a number of cases, a set of lazy, incompetent, and careless teachers to do whatever they wanted in government schools. It's common knowledge, and colleges, of course. It's a common knowledge that the teachers in government schools and colleges have little accountability. In many schools, they have semi-literates as teachers. No policy is going to change this scene unless this problem is addressed with the requisite sincerity and firmness if necessary. Why are the parents flocking to teaching shops even when they know that the government schools are nearby? Why is it happening even in states like in better off states like Tamil Nadu? These are the questions that are to be answered. Unfortunately, the policy just skirts around them. They don't answer these questions at all. I must say, I said many times, I must say, I'm sorely disappointed with the policy, which in effect says that every aspect of education in India will be decided by the central government. The state government's role appears to be periphery. they will perhaps serve as ball boys in the game of education. It appears that way. Okay. There is a paragraph in the Kasturirangan report that continues to haunt me. It says a small number, say 5, of multidisciplinary education research universities providing world-class liberal arts education and modeled after some of the best universities in world history. Let me read this again. A small number of multidisciplinary education research universities providing world-class liberal arts education and modeled after some of the best universities in world histories such as Nalanda and the Ivy League schools in the US will be set up in India within the next 5 years. To an unbiased citizen whose sole interest is redemption of Indian education, such a paragraph is at once grating and I will say obscenely dishonest. How will you model a modern university after Nalanda, which was an ancient theological center and about which nothing much is known? What is the connection between Nalanda and the Ivy League colleges of the US? They all think that the ancient India was all honey and treacle, so they want to make India again ancient. Good luck to them. The policy statement abounds in such obscenities in different forms. That a team of top eggheads, that is educational intellectuals in our country, could produce a document of such resounding emptiness is perhaps indicative of the fast arriving intellectual bankruptcy of our nation. Thank you.